In the previous video on essay genres, which if you haven't seen is linked below, I said that we were going to adopt the argumentative essay throughout this writing series. So as review, an argumentative essay is one that tries to prove an argument or sustain your opinion. An argument can also be referred to in academic terms as a main idea or a thesis statement. The thesis statement is the most important sentence in your essay. It tells the reader what you intend to write about and what you intend or endeavor to prove. If your thesis statement is poor, your essay will also be poor. No chance of being very good. If your thesis statement is good, your essay has a chance to be good. If your thesis statement is excellent, your essay has a chance also to be excellent. In other words, the thesis statement reveals the essay's potential. Let me illustrate this. Take this thesis statement. I think grading and not grading should be analyzed to determine effects. This is stylistically poor, but is also lacking a real core or main idea. The student announces that he will consider the topic. Without even reading the essay, it will either fail or receive a low pass. The next thesis statement, grading students should be mandatory, is very clear, very good style, and very natural style. This thesis statement reveals or suggests that the essay has a chance to be very good or even excellent, depending, of course, on how it is argued in the body of the essay. The thesis statement contains a topic and a controlling idea. The controlling idea is the vantage point or perspective of the general topic. So, for example, hurricanes cause more damage than other natural disasters. The topic of this essay is hurricanes. The controlling idea or angle of the topic is it causes significant damage. Or to be more precise, it causes more damage than other natural disasters. Let's take another example. Of all inventions of transport in the 20th century, cars have had the greatest impact on society. The topic is cars. This essay is going to discuss cars, but it will do so from a particular perspective, their impact on society. That's the controlling idea, which, in other words, is what you're going to argue. Understanding the composition of the thesis statement and how these two elements relate to each other is important in creating interesting thesis statements. Now let's look at characteristics of a good thesis statement. First, it makes one main point. It's, of course, possible to make more than this, but it is much more difficult to argue 2 points convincingly and in equal measure. You can have subpoints, but I recommend sticking to one main idea. So, for example, of all transport, cars have had the greatest impact on society. With this thesis, you can focus solely on measuring impact. But if we try to argue 2 points, then the task becomes significantly more difficult. Cars have created the most wealth among technical inventions and the most pollution. Here, we not only have to prove 2 very different points, but we must also justify why they are argued together in the same essay. The next most important point to emphasize about the thesis statement is that it should be arguable, or more precisely, falsifiable. If you can't be wrong, then it isn't an argument. It's a fact. Look at these examples. Between 1950 and 1980, more cars were produced than any other form of transportation. This is not a thesis statement. It is either a fact or a falsehood, both of which can be verified with appropriate statistics. But there is nothing to argue, no room for opinions. The facts will speak for themselves. Cars have had a greater impact on the transformation of city life than any other form of transportation. This thesis statement is arguable, since you can't merely find statistics to verify it as a fact. It is debatable, and your position depends on how you argue it, since trains and waterways also have a claim on societal transformations. Let's look at one more example, since this is often a problem with inexperienced writers. Paintings are found in museums. This example is rather obviously a fact, so there's nothing to argue. By contrast, artists' paintings should not be censored by museums. This is an opinion that needs supporting evidence. People can disagree or debate this sensitive topic. Thirdly, a thesis statement should be short and clear. That's my suggestion for young writers anyway, since there is a lot at stake with this sentence. If your thesis statement is unclear, you have no chance of winning the reader over. Thus, I recommend a relatively short sentence, since these, that is, short sentences, are less prone than long sentences to be ambiguous or unclear. Let's look at some examples. Students should be formally graded in school. This statement is clear and to the point. But for some reason, students feel that short sentences are overly simplistic ones and thus try to write long, complicated sentences, feeling somehow that these reveal an air of sophistication and intelligence. For example, students studying in school need to know their results and can find importance in the outcomes which teachers themselves determine. This statement, which makes a similar point as the earlier one, is wordy and not very clear. Now, don't misunderstand me. You can indeed extend or enlarge the first sentence if you want to include a key supporting idea. So, for example, students should be formally assessed in school as grades encourage learning. This last part of the sentence, the as clause, reveals to the reader the key supporting idea that will be discussed in the body of the essay. If you have two main supporting points, you may include them both. Students should be formally assessed in school as grades encourage learning and hold learners accountable. Next, a thesis must be a complete sentence. That is to say, it must have a subject and a verb. This example is one that I commonly see at university. The impact of the automobile on city life. At first glance, this appears to be a thesis statement, but this statement lacks a verb, so it is a title, not a sentence, nor a thesis statement. To be a thesis statement, we need a verb. The impact of the automobile on city life is significant. Or better yet, the automobile has had a significant impact on the city. The fifth characteristic of the thesis statement is that it should be the most general statement on the topic, besides, of course, the opening context. In other words, everything in the body of the essay should fall within the range of the thesis statement. So, for example, it would be odd to find an extended discussion on airplanes or trains within an essay on cars. It would also be confusing to read a significant segment on the types of government failures around the world in an essay on social media within government. There is, of course, a relationship between these ideas that I've just mentioned in the two examples, but not direct enough to substantiate large coverage. A related point is that a thesis statement should not be too broad. This, in my view, is the biggest problem amongst students writing thesis statements. They tend to write thesis statements that are too broad. And when the topic is too broad or general, it is uninteresting because the points or ideas that you are likely to make will be obvious or too general to mean much. Take these examples. Cars have had a great impact on society is a thesis statement that is obvious and very broad. If we narrow down the controlling idea a little, then it becomes more interesting. What sort of impact do we want to talk about? Cars have transformed the layout of the large city in the US. This thesis statement is narrower, more interesting, and perhaps easier to argue. In fact, the narrower the topic, the easier it is to argue. Now, we don't want to get too narrow so as to make the topic irrelevant. The number of cars have transformed the street grid of downtown Baltimore between 7th and 10th Streets. But in my experience, students rarely, if ever, specify too precisely, since this involves a very refined thinking, which they are still developing. They almost always write too broadly. And this is the task or challenge of the teacher, to identify overly general thinking and challenge students to think in more detail. Another way to determine whether your topic is too broad or not is to ask, can I argue this thesis statement convincingly in the number of pages stipulated or assigned by the teacher? If you have 3 pages to write on this topic, cars have had a great impact on society, you probably aren't going to say anything interesting. However, if you focus on one city within the US during a particular time period, then the topic is more manageable. The emergence of the automobile created an unusual infrastructural development in New York City in the 1970s. Here we can focus on the trends of one city, a unique city in the US, New York City, and readers will probably find it interesting. Since writing too broadly is the Achilles heel or weakness of most young writers, let's devote a bit more time to this issue. Older couples from healthy family backgrounds make better parents. This statement is too general and thus rather uninteresting because you can't possibly address such a broad topic with interesting details. And if you do focus on interesting details, then you must abandon your thesis statement, causing the reader to be confused. So we can narrow it down by asking more detailed questions. Where are these couples? What is the time period? The present, the 1990s, the 1950s? How do we define young? If we answer these questions by doing a bit more background reading, we might come up with something like this. In the 1960s, teenage parents in Warsaw raised more children to be criminals than all mothers over 20 did. Number 6, the thesis statement should or is generally near the end of the introduction, especially in short essays. Now, if you write essays that are a bit longer, they might fall somewhere in the middle. In my experience writing articles, it falls somewhere in the middle to the end of the introduction. The paragraph next to me is an example introduction, and you'll see that the underlying thesis statement is at the end of that paragraph. There are 2 general questions that you want to ask yourself about your thesis statement and topic. Is it important? Is it interesting? If you want to ensure that you have an interesting thesis statement, create one that is counterintuitive, one that is contrary to common sense. So, for example, if you argued that cars, which are traditionally known for generating lots of air pollution through their exhaust systems, actually helped reduce air pollution, then this would almost certainly be an interesting essay, assuming you had evidence to support your point. It would be interesting because it is surprising. This is what I mean by counterintuitive. Finally, we should turn to the actual English of the thesis statement. There are 2 main styles of communicating your main idea. First, as an announcement, this essay will argue that truth-telling is the highest calling for those in important relationships. So the announcement is, this essay will argue, this essay will show, this essay will attempt to reveal. Or secondly, you can simply state the thesis. Truth-telling is the highest calling for those in important relationships. Both options are fine. Both are standard approaches in the West. I want to give stylistic commentary to a few more thesis statements. Since most of you are learning English and developing a feel for style, this is where I feel I, as a native speaker, can provide valuable stylistic insight. Let's look at an earlier theme on students and grading. Students should be formally assessed in school as grades encourage learning. This is a well-written sentence and hints at the rationale or logic that will be used. Motivation. This indicates to me that the student has a logical mind. Next, teacher discretion should determine grading procedures. This sentence is short, to the point, and well written. It also suggests original thinking, since in the class that this was actually assigned, this was a unique idea. This sentence indicates to me, the teacher, that the student has an ability to think creatively or abstractly. A third example, teachers should determine whether students are graded or not. This sentence says the same thing as the previous one. So which one is better? Neither. They are different and equally good. They are both clear and concise. There's no greater calling for the writer than clarity. Be clear first, then be creative. Reversing this process produces poor results in most cases. Finally, we come to practical application. This is what I feel is one of the most important elements in teaching, especially in the social sciences, relating a subject-based skill to one's future career. In other words, finding a practical application for the student's future. In our present case, the principles discussed about thesis statements and essays relate directly to any type of important presentation that you'll make in your life. If you are an assistant providing key consultation to a diplomat, or if you're a business manager presenting the latest strategy for your part of the business to the board of directors or your bosses, or if you're a director of a school and you're instructing your teachers about the school's teaching methodology and philosophy, then you need to be adept at creating an interesting, challenging, important, and provable thesis. Anyone in leadership needs to communicate their main message effectively and clearly. The skills you learned in this video can be applied to any written or spoken presentation or paper. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel, hit the notification button, and tell your friends about it. For further study and practice of thesis statements, see the links below this video. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned next Tuesday for the next video segment in this formal writing series. Thank you.